Let's dive deep into the tragic tales of 9 legendary icons from the Golden Age who completely destroyed their mugs with disastrous cosmetic procedures. These weren't just actors. They were the visual definition of an entire generation. We are talking about the kind of god-tier beauty that inspired fantasies across the globe right up until the moment they decided to wage a war against the clock that they simply couldn't win. The real heartbreak regarding Tinseltown's biggest legends isn't the fact that they got older, because that happens to everyone. The tragedy lies in the extreme lengths they went to because they refused to embrace reality. In a frantic, panic-induced attempt to freeze their moneymakers in amber, they ended up obliterating the very unique qualities that put them on the map in the first place. One notorious Beverly Hills surgeon who sliced and diced his way through the 60s all the way to the 90s confessed that his most depressing appointments involved fading idols. They would march in, slap down a glossy headshot from 3 decades prior and demand, "Turn me back into this person." It was a complete fantasy, a delusional demand that set the stage for a parade of medical catastrophes and botched outcomes that we are still talking about today. We aren't talking about a little Botox here or a subtle filler there to smooth things out. No, these were aggressive, extreme overhauls that left cherished visages looking stiff, twisted, and totally alien to the fans who loved them. The specific quirks and distinct traits that gave these celebrities their magic were relentlessly carved away by the scalpel, leaving nothing but a generic, frightened look behind. The most gut-wrenching example has to be the silent era queen, who set the bar for glamour only to end up as a horror story. Early primitive facelifts pulled her skin so tight she physically lost the ability to emote. The woman once universally dubbed America's sweetheart couldn't even crack a genuine smile for the paparazzi cameras that had once worshipped her every move. Then you had the heartthrob leading man whose rugged, chiseled good looks collapsed into a weird, shiny wax figure stare. It absolutely horrified the fan base, who still held on to memories of his natural magnetism and charisma from the glory days. A veteran makeup artist who tried to salvage these faces in their twilight years put it perfectly. They didn't just alter their looks, they wiped out their biographies. They effectively erased their own history. Every laugh line, every wrinkle earned through experience, the map of their lives was surgically sliced off like it was a dirty secret to be ashamed of. What makes these transformations particularly devastating is the timing. This happened long before the safety nets of modern medicine existed. While stars in 2026 benefit from micro-adjustments refined over 50 years, these pioneers were essentially wealthy lab rats, volunteering for experimental surgeries that often ended in carnage. But the most gripping part of this mess is how it exposes the brutal hypocrisy of the film business. It is an industry that obsessively worships youth while simultaneously selling products based entirely on nostalgia for the past. Caught in that impossible vice grip, stars made panic-driven choices that robbed the audience of the chance to see them grow old with dignity and grace. Let's kick things off with the Titan who practically laid the bricks for Hollywood, only to become patient zero for cosmetic nightmares. She once famously said, "Well, it is very nice to be able to thank them all." But behind the scenes, gratitude was being replaced by deep insecurity. Mary Pickford, America's sweetheart, now frozen in time. You have to understand, Mary Pickford wasn't just a celebrity. She was the industry itself, co-founder of United Artists, the first power player to snag $1 million contract, and the architect of modern stardom. With her trademark golden ringlets and an angelic face, she was the undisputed queen of the silent screen era. When audiences fell for the movies, they were really falling for Mary, which makes the eventual destruction of that face in her later years all the more devastating. As one silent film expert noted, Mary didn't just write the rulebook on acting, she unfortunately wrote the prologue on plastic surgery horror stories too. She went under the knife for some of the earliest cosmetic work in Hollywood history back in the 1930s, an era when plastic surgery was basically synonymous with experimental butchery. Pickford's first lift happened around 1933. She was hitting 40 and terrified of losing her innocent girl roles, struggling to transition into more mature parts. The doctors back then had zero clue about muscle structure. They just grabbed the skin, yanked it back until it screamed, and snipped off the excess. They operated with almost no understanding of facial anatomy or how the underlying tissue supports the face. A medical historian pointed out that these operations were barbaric compared to the refined procedures of today. Early facelifts were crude, blunt force operations. Imagine stretching a canvas over a wooden frame until it's rock hard. That's what they did to her face, with absolutely no regard for how a human being actually moves or emotes. The outcome was immediate and unsettling. Close friends started whispering about the weird plastic tightness around her eyes and an eerie smoothness that paralysed her legendary expressiveness. But instead of taking that as a massive red flag, this first procedure kicked off a dangerous addiction that spanned decades. By the 1940s, after going back for more, Mary's face had solidified into the frozen statue-like quality that would sadly become her legacy. Her skin was winched so tight against her skull that natural human reactions were physically impossible. The face that once conveyed 1,000 emotions without saying a word was now locked in a permanent, unmoving prison. A cinematographer who tried to light her in those final days put it bluntly, America's sweetheart had turned into a store mannequin. The cruelest twist of fate is that the surgeries intended to keep her in the spotlight actually forced her into the shadows, accelerating her retirement. Even as technology got slightly better, Pickford kept chasing a fix, praying the next operation would undo the damage of the last. But it was a losing game. Instead, every new incision just stretched her further away from reality, compounding the tragedy with every stitch. By the time the swinging 60s rolled around, Mary Pickford had basically vanished, turning into a total hermit at her estate pick fair. On the rare occasions she actually stepped out, people were absolutely floored by what they saw. Her skin was pulled back so aggressively it looked painful. Her hairline had migrated halfway up her scalp from endless tucks, and creepiest of all, her face was frozen in a way that made genuine emotion impossible. Douglas Fairbanks Jr. wasn't just some random acquaintance. He'd grown up in her shadow and known the real Mary since he was just a kid running around the studio lots. Yet rumour has it that when he bumped into her at a swanky industry bash in the late 60s, he stared right through her, having zero clue who the woman standing in front of him actually was. Once someone whispered her name to him, he was horrified later, spilling the tea to his inner circle that she looked less like his old friend and more like a terrifying wax museum replica of Mary Pickford that got the details wrong. It was a cruel twist of fate, the silent film icon, who built an empire on her ability to convey heartbreak with a single twitch of her lip, had completely lost the physical capacity to crack a genuine smile in her twilight years. When the Academy tried to honour her with a Lifetime Achievement Oscar back in 1976, she flat out refused to leave her fortress, opting to send a pre-taped acceptance speech instead of facing the cameras live. That footage was stage managed within an inch of its life, heavily filtered and lit specifically to hide the disastrous results of the scalpel work done to one of the most legendary mugs in cinema history. One film historian nailed the tragedy, noting that Mary didn't just work in Hollywood, she literally built the town only to end up chewed up and spit out by the very beauty standards she helped establish. The dream factory she constructed eventually gaslit her into believing that growing older wasn't a natural process but a defect that needed to be surgically scrubbed away at any cost. Instead of wearing her age like a badge of honour, she was brainwashed into treating her own face like a mistake that required constant correction until nothing original remained. While Mary's botched look was largely due to the butcher shop nature of early plastic surgery, our next lady took the concept of facial renovation and cranked the dial up to 11. She didn't hide in the shadows, she flipped the script, turning her obsession with going under the knife into a weird kind of public spectacle and career move. You want to talk about courage? Being a war hero is one thing, but standing in front of a mirror with a surgeon's marker takes a different kind of guts, and honestly, I adored that fearlessness about him. We are talking about the one and only Joan Rivers, the woman who realised that if you can't beat the ageing process, you might as well make it the butt of the joke. Joan wasn't strictly a Golden Age siren, but she had one foot in the old studio system, rubbing elbows with the greats, before spending decades morphing herself into the ultimate poster child for cosmetic addiction. She spent years treating her body like a fixer-upper house, eventually cementing her legacy not just as a comic, but as arguably the most notorious surgery junkie the entertainment world has ever seen. As one veteran gossip columnist put it, Joan went from cutting people down with her wit to literally cutting up her own face until it couldn't move anymore. It's a crying shame because her immobilised features eventually became the main attraction, distracting everyone from the fact that she was a groundbreaking comedy genius underneath all of that taut skin. Her romance with the scalpel started out innocent enough, just a standard nip and tuck around the eyes in her 30s, followed by a routine tightening in her 40s to stay fresh. But while her peers were lying through their teeth about good genes and plenty of sleep, Joan went the other way, broadcasting her appointments and making the operating table a central character in her stand-up routine. She dropped one of the most legendary lines in showbiz history, cracking that she had so much plastic in her system that upon her death, her remains should be donated straight to the Tupperware Corporation. That brutal honesty was a breath of fresh air in a town built on smokescreens, but let's be real, it was also a smokescreen for something much darker, bubbling beneath the surface. What started as simple career maintenance snowballed into a full-blown dependency, with Rivers herself admitting she eventually lost count after undergoing hundreds of separate modifications. We're talking the full menu: aggressive facelifts, eye work, neck tightening, brow raises, cheek implants, chin shaving, and enough Botox and fillers to sink a ship, all of which she casually referred to as minor maintenance. A close pal revealed that Joan actually hauled her medical charts around in a literal suitcase like she was carrying nuclear launch codes. It wasn't even for the surgeon's benefit. She carried them because she'd been under the knife so many times she couldn't physically recall what parts of her were original and what had been remodeled. Those papers read less like a patient history and more like the blueprints for a never-ending construction project, resulting in a visage that looked less human and more like a synthetic approximation of a face. By the time the 1990s rolled around, her mug had shifted so drastically that the tabloids were running front-page stories about her bizarre look, completely ignoring her actual work. Even the late-night hosts, who used to be terrified of getting roasted by her, started using her wind tunnel face as easy fodder for their opening monologues. But here's the genius part. Joan took that ridicule and weaponized it, using self-deprecation like a suit of armour to beat everyone else to the punch. Whenever the press got nasty about her alien-like appearance, she didn't cry about it. She just wrote 5 new minutes of material about how tight her face was and sold it to the highest bidder. She allegedly told her daughter Melissa after a particularly savage article came out, "Nobody gets to laugh at me unless I give them the green light to do it." Her philosophy was simple: if I make the joke first and I make it funnier than they can, then I win and they lose. From a business standpoint, the strategy was absolute gold, keeping her booked and busy when most women her age were being put out to pasture. Rivers stayed on top of the game right up until she passed at 81, but the toll on her body was immense. If you held up a picture of her from the start, the woman at the end was a complete stranger. That unrecognisability wasn't because of the clock ticking. It was the direct result of scar tissue on top of scar tissue from decades of surgical interference. A makeup artist who spent years trying to work with Joan's altered canvas noted that the tragedy wasn't the surgery itself, but the desperate psychological need behind it. She nailed the brutal truth of the industry when she confessed, "In this town, lines on your face don't show character or wisdom. They just tell casting directors you're ready for the unemployment line." At least Joan could laugh about her transformation, but our next subject chased the plastic dream with a terrifying intensity that freaked out even the most vanity-obsessed Hollywood insiders. We are moving from comedy to horror. Now looking at a case so extreme, it made the rest of Beverly Hills look natural by comparison. She walked out of her penthouse thinking she looked glamorous while the rest of the world stared in absolute disbelief. Enter Jocelyn Wildenstein, the woman who became the walking, talking definition of be careful what you wish for in the world of cosmetic enhancement. She was never a star of the silver screen, yet Jocelyn managed to become the ultimate red flag for every aging actress, showing exactly what happens when you have unlimited money and zero impulse control. Her metamorphosis was so jarring and publicly documented that it went beyond bad plastic surgery and entered the realm of a psychological breakdown played out in flesh and blood. To say she didn't age would be a massive understatement. She didn't just get older, she underwent a full-blown biological mutation. That was the brutal assessment dropped by a top-tier Beverly Hills surgeon who actually refused to work on her back in the 1990s. The catastrophe that unfolded across her visage had nothing to do with preserving a youthful glow. It was a deliberate march toward becoming something that defied human taxonomy. The saga of Jocelyn Wildenstein allegedly kicked off with a desperate, twisted bid to keep the attention of her then-husband, billionaire art mogul, Alec Wildenstein, who had a known fetish for jungle predators. If the gossip columns and insiders are to be believed, she marched into clinics with a very specific mandate to carve and mould her features until she resembled a wild lynx. She demanded the full package cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass eyes, pulled upward into a permanent cat-like squint, and a nose flattened into an animalistic shape. The outcome was nothing short of jarring. After enduring a relentless carousel of heavy-duty facelifts, aggressive eye tilt, cheek implants the size of golf balls, lip inflations, and chin reconstruction, coupled with enough filler to sink a ship, Wildenstein morphed into a spectacle that managed to shock a town as superficial and surgery-obsessed as Hollywood. Experts in the field look at her file as the terminal station of aesthetic addiction, according to a psychiatrist who deals with extreme body dysmorphia cases. We are entering dangerous territory when the goal shifts from looking a bit fresher to literally transitioning into a different species entirely. At that point, it is no longer about vanity or cosmetics. It is a descent into a much darker psychological abyss. The reason Wildenstein's tragic trajectory matters to our story about Golden Age icons is that she serves as the ghost of Christmas future for every star who flirted with the scalpel. So many of those legendary beauties took the first few steps down that identical garden path, unaware that it led to the same extreme destination she reached. It is the seductive, toxic belief that surgical tools can do more than just pause time, that they can actually beat Mother Nature into submission and improve upon perfection. A prominent dermatologist on Rodeo Drive spilled the tea, admitting that clients frequently bring in Jocelyn's photo not as a goal, but as a terrified plea. They point a shaking finger at her image and beg, "Promise me I won't end up looking like this." She has effectively become the global poster child for plastic surgery disasters. It is estimated that Wildenstein torched over $4 million, destroying her own face, resulting in a look so jarringly unique that anonymity is now impossible for her. Her face has transcended celebrity gossip to become a cultural meme featured in everything from slasher flicks to medical textbooks, as the definitive warning label for what happens when cosmetic intervention goes completely off the rails. The most heartbreaking aspect of the whole circus is that she genuinely seems to think she looks fabulous, noted a Society writer who sat down with her in the early 2000s. There is a total break between the mirror she looks into and the reality the rest of the world sees, which just proves how warped a person's self-image can get in that bubble. While the Catwoman saga is an extreme outlier, our next legend proves that even the most sophisticated high-class dames were not immune to the knife. They too fell victim to the siren song of eternal youth, often with results that completely betrayed the charm and elegance their public images were built upon. You simply love them, drag them to bed, and figure out the messy details later. Enter Zsa Gabor, the woman who practically invented being famous for being famous, whose glamour eventually froze into mask. She built an empire on 3 pillars: her roster of 9 husbands, her razor-sharp wit that could level a room, and a beauty that was nothing short of extraordinary. But as the years ticked by, her determination to cling to that beauty became a war against time, a battle that eventually robbed her of the very tool that made her a star, her expressive face. She managed to keep the glitz, but she sacrificed the humanity, observed a veteran Hollywood photographer who snapped her pictures for decades. Witnessing her face stiffen over the years was tragic. It was like watching a vibrant, colourful masterpiece slowly get buried under layer after layer of cheap varnish. Gabor didn't wait for the wrinkles to set in. She jumped on the surgical bandwagon way ahead of the curve, with her first lift documented in the 1950s when she was barely out of her 30s. This pioneering dive into the world of nip and tuck established a dependency pattern that would dominate the rest of her very long life. To her credit, Zaza never pretended to age gracefully. She was brutally honest about her disdain for getting older. She absolutely loathed it, her former stylist recalled. She used to quip, "Darling, back in Hungary we have a motto, it is always better to look good than to look real." And make no mistake, she followed that philosophy right off the edge of the cliff. By the time the 1970s rolled around after rounds of lifts, eyelid work, and God knows what else, the cracks began to show, or rather the lack of them. People noticed the wind tunnel look that permanently startled gaze, and the skin pulled so tight around her mouth that smiling became a physical challenge, draining all the natural life from her once animated features. What made this transformation so gut-wrenching was that Gabor's entire brand was built on her bubbly, vivacious personality and storytelling. As her face turned into an immobile mask, she tried to compensate by turning up the volume on everything else bigger diamonds. Massive towering wigs and costumes that screamed for attention as if she were trying to distract the audience from the mannequin staring back at them. By the 1980s, a director who worked with her on TV noted that her face was essentially stone. It barely moved when the cameras rolled. We had to completely change how we filmed her because the poor woman could no longer register shock, joy, or anger on her face. She had to do all the heavy lifting with that famous voice and her hand gestures because the facial muscles had checked out. Unlike other fading beauties who hid away in mansions as the surgery went south, Gabor stayed defiantly in the spotlight well into her 80s, even as she looked increasingly synthetic. Because she refused to hide, she left us with a frame-by-frame documentary of what progressive surgical modification actually looks like over a lifetime. But the tragedy of what happened to Zaza's face goes deeper than simple narcissism or vanity. It wasn't just vanity, explained a cultural historian who has spent years analysing Tinseltown's toxic relationship with the ageing process. This behaviour reflected a tragic bone-deep conviction that a woman's worth was inextricably bound to her youth and physical perfection. She was, in the end, both the primary victim and the most enthusiastic enforcer of Hollywood's most destructive myth. As the years rolled on, particularly following a horrific car accident and a spiral of declining health that kept her away from the cameras, Gabor retreated into the shadows, becoming increasingly reclusive. When the world finally saw her final photographs, they revealed a visage so radically altered by decades of aggressive surgical intervention that the face, looking back, bore almost zero resemblance to the vibrant, sparkling Hungarian bombshell who had once held all of Hollywood in the palm of her hand. There is a gut-wrenching irony here. The very procedures she endured to freeze time and preserve her legendary beauty were the exact things that ultimately erased it. As the historian poignantly concluded in her desperate clawing attempt to remain forever young, she stripped away the unique quirks and features that had made her undeniably Zaza. While Gabor's saga was a lifelong pledge of allegiance to glamour at any cost, our next story strikes a heavier, perhaps even more tragic note. We turn our gaze to a silver screen titan, a handsome leading man whose God-given good looks were ultimately sabotaged by his own frantic efforts to keep them. Listen to this telling clip. I certainly have a lot of women, and you have said in your autobiography that you did. Enter Tony Curtis, the heartbreaking slide from premier Hollywood heartthrob to a mask of waxy immobility. Back in the 1950s, Tony Curtis didn't just look good, he embodied a completely new paradigm of male beauty in the film industry. He was impossibly pretty sultry, with cascading dark curls and sensitive soulful features that allowed him to pivot effortlessly between gritty action roles and swoon-worthy romantic leads. His unforgettable turns in classics like Sweet Smell of Success and Some Like It hot cemented him as absolute royalty in the looks department, which makes his later aesthetic evolution all the more jarring to witness. It was like watching a matinee idol slowly morph into a wax museum exhibit, remarked a ruthless film critic who sat down with Curtis during the actor's twilight years. The Observer noted that it looked as if a sculptor had attempted to build a replica of Tony Curtis, while possessing only a passing familiarity with actual human anatomy. Curtis's obsession with the scalpel really became undeniable in the 1980s when he was navigating his 60s, a starting point that was relatively late compared to many of his peers. At first, the work seemed minor, maybe a subtle lift around the eyes or a refresh of the jawline. But as the decade wore on, the tweaks became aggressive, dramatic, and frankly, bizarre. Male plastic surgery is a minefield with unique challenges, explained a top-tier Beverly Hills surgeon who specialises in masculine aesthetic procedures. Men aren't just women with beards. They have significantly thicker dermis, more robust facial muscles, and much sharper bone density. When doctors try to apply the same dainty techniques designed for aging actresses to a man's face, the outcome is often a disastrous artificial look. By the time the 1990s rolled around, Curtis's appearance had undergone a radical and unsettling transformation. That once expressive mug was replaced by a smooth taut mask that stood in stark, uncomfortable contrast to his biological age. His skin took on that telltale wind tunnel sheen, tight, shiny, and stretched to the limit, while the depth of his features seemed to flatten out, losing their dimension. But here is the kicker. This physical freezing coincided with a massive creative explosion in his life as he gained serious respect as a painter, churning out vibrant, emotional, expressionist artworks. The irony was screamingly loud as his canvas burst with life. His own face was becoming increasingly incapable of showing emotion, a contradiction that the critics absolutely tore apart. There was something deeply poignant about watching him speak passionately about the raw emotion in his paintings while his face remained eerily still, noted an art critic who covered a Curtis gallery opening in the early 2000s. It was as if every ounce of his soul's expressiveness had been siphoned out of his body and poured directly onto the canvas, leaving nothing behind for the man himself. In true old-school fashion, Curtis never publicly admitted to the work a code of silence, typical for male stars of his era, but that denial just created a massive, uncanny elephant in the room. Audiences were silently asked to pretend they didn't see the radical reconstruction of one of the world's most famous faces. He seemed genuinely baffled when interviewers reacted to his new look. Recalled a journalist who spent time with Curtis for a film retrospective. It was heartbreaking, as if he looked in the mirror and genuinely still saw the young kid from Some Like It. Hot unable to grasp that the scalpel had created something entirely different. Toward the end of his life, his appearance settled into what one particularly savage columnist described as a state of permanent frozen surprise. You could still see the ghost of the handsome features that made him a star, but they were rearranged like a blurry photocopy of a masterpiece, rather than a natural evolution of the man. The tragedy wasn't just what the doctors did to his face, reflected a longtime friend after Curtis passed away in 2010. The saddest part is that he never needed it in the first place. He had the bones, the eyes, the charisma. He would have been a stunningly handsome older man, naturally. Instead, his legacy is complicated, forever shadowed by a cosmetic obsession that became a distraction from his immense, genuine talents. While Tony Curtis serves as a cautionary tale about the unique pitfalls of male cosmetic surgery, our next subject proves that no one is safe from the pressure to stay young. So I did the commercial, and he kept his word, and he gave my girlfriend a commercial. Get ready for a deep dive into Linda Evans, the Dynasty icon, the impending disaster and the systematic destruction of American natural beauty. Linda Evans holds a fascinating place in Tinseltown history, bridging the gap between the old school studio system and the modern celebrity era, eventually skyrocketing to global fame in the 1980s as the iconic Crystal Carrington on Dynasty. However, when you examine her timeline, what stands out most vividly isn't just her filmography, but the jarring contrast between the fresh-faced girl who started in the business and the radically altered, almost unrecognisable visage that she presented to the world in her later years. One Hollywood makeup veteran who worked with Evans through various decades put it bluntly, she spent so much energy chasing the fountain of youth that she ended up losing the very essence of who she was. Honestly, in the history of celebrity makeovers, few have been so complete and, frankly, so entirely unnecessary. She started with the kind of genetic lottery win, perfect bone structure and glowing skin that was destined to age like a fine wine. Back in the 1960s, Evans was the definition of fresh-faced allure, boasting delicate features and an expressive quality that the camera absolutely adored, making her a natural fit for television close-ups. By the time the late 1970s rolled around and she hit middle age, there were whispers of minor tweaks, maybe a conservative eye lift or tiny adjustments, but nothing that screamed plastic surgery. The real shift, the point of no return, seemed to happen after the cameras stopped rolling on Dynasty in the late 1980s. As she navigated her late 40s and early 50s, her face began to morph in ways that raised eyebrows, alarming even the most surgery-desensitized observers in Los Angeles. An entertainment journalist who covered her career noted that the doctors were not enhancing her natural gifts. They were actively overwriting them. This reporter had sat down with Evans numerous times over the decades and watched the slow-motion evolution firsthand. With every interview, she looked less like Linda Evans and more like a sketch artist's vague interpretation of what a star implies she should look like. By the time we hit the 2000s, the metamorphosis was finalised. The Linda we knew was effectively gone. Those once refined features had been swapped out for that infamous pillow face, overfilled tight and bearing almost zero resemblance to her younger self. Her cheeks looked permanently swollen. Her lips were pumped up to disproportionate sizes and the skin was pulled so taut that her natural facial architecture was obliterated. The true tragedy here is the timing, as this radical physical change happened right as she was ditching the Hollywood rat race for a zen, nature-focused existence up in Washington state. While she was out there preaching about authenticity and grounding oneself in nature, her face was telling a contradictory story of synthetic intervention. It was a visual rejection of the very natural aging process she claimed to embrace in her philosophy. A writer who profiled her for a major women's magazine in the early 2000s pointed out the massive disconnect between her spiritual words and her physical reality. She would wax poetic about flowing with life's seasons and accepting the passage of time, all while her face displayed the undeniable scars of a desperate battle to stop that clock from ticking. Evans has mostly stayed mum on the topic, but in an interview back in 2014, she dropped a few breadcrumbs suggesting she harbours some deep regrets. She admitted that she had made mistakes and put her trust in the wrong hands, chalking it up to the messy journey of life. The heartbreaking part is playing the what-if game, imagining how stunning she would have been if she had just let gravity do its thing. With that bone structure, she was on track to become a strikingly elegant matriarch, wearing her lines as a badge of a life fully lived, rather than freezing herself in time. One prominent Hollywood photographer who has snapped countless aging legends confessed that Evans's case makes him the angriest of them all. He argued that sure, some folks need a little tune-up as the years roll by to maintain their look. But Linda, she needed absolutely nothing. She was flawless, full stop. What they did to her wasn't an improvement. It was total erasure. But while Evans's story is about the pursuit of an impossible ideal, our next subject faced a nightmare that was far more sinister. We are talking about a catastrophic surgical train wreck caused by a completely unqualified hack. Was this person a stranger to the halls of Graceland? Definitely not. We are looking at Priscilla Presley, a woman who was brutally betrayed by the beauty industry's black market. Priscilla has always held a bizarre elevated status in pop culture, not just a star, but bona fide American royalty thanks to her union with the King Elvis. Her face was once one of the most recognisable on the planet, which makes the disaster that befell her all the more horrifying to witness. As a top Beverly Hills plastic surgeon who later consulted on fixing the mess put it, she trusted the wrong person and paid the price every time she looked in the mirror. This wasn't simple vanity gone wrong. It was straight-up victimization by a predator. Back in the 1960s and 1970s, her look was iconic, those high cheekbones, the almond eyes, the delicate features that photographers couldn't get enough of. When she hit her 40s, she reportedly dabbled in the standard Hollywood maintenance plan, subtle refinements to keep things fresh without changing the map. But the nightmare started around 2003 when Presley, along with a laundry list of other A-listers, got tangled up with an unlicensed practitioner. It was marketed as a revolutionary low-risk cosmetic enhancement, the kind of secret treatment only the elite knew about. But instead of medical-grade fillers, this scammer was allegedly pumping industrial-grade silicone into people's faces. We are talking about the kind of stuff used to grease car engines injected right into delicate facial tissue. A cosmetic dermatologist familiar with the case broke it down. It was essentially injecting mechanical grease into a human being. The fallout is catastrophic and usually permanent. This substance doesn't stay put. It moves around, it hardens like cement, and it destroys everything in its path. The foreign substance acts like a wrecking ball on a cellular level, completely obliterating the delicate tissue it touches. Almost instantly, the outcome shifted from a simple cosmetic touch-up to a waking nightmare. Priscilla's legendary visage began to warp, losing its symmetry and taking on a rigid, wax-like texture that looked nothing like human skin. Those iconic sculpted cheekbones we all admired were suddenly twisted out of shape. Even her radiant smile was stolen, left crooked and strained, while the porcelain smoothness of her complexion gave way to strange, lumpy protrusions that simply shouldn't exist. The truly gut-wrenching part of this saga isn't vanity run wild. Unlike the stars who go under the knife for a total overhaul, insiders claim she was merely looking for a subtle refresh, a tiny tweak to turn back the clock. But instead of a fountain of youth, she walked straight into a trap, falling victim to what can only be described as a brutal medical attack by a predator targeting Hollywood's elite. As one top-tier Beverly Hills surgeon bluntly put it, the man holding the needle had zero business touching a patient. He wasn't a physician, he was a full-blown con artist. Icons like Priscilla are the perfect mark because they live in a fishbowl and are desperate for privacy, often relying on hushed whispers and recommendations from their inner circle rather than official channels. The villain of this story, Daniel Serrano, finally faced the music, getting slapped with handcuffs and serving prison time for wielding a syringe without a valid medical license. Justice might have been served, but for the women he butchered, the sentence was a life term. The physical devastation inflicted on Presley was effectively irreversible. Although skilled surgeons have managed to salvage some of her looks through agonising corrective work, a significant amount of that low-grade industrial lubricant is fused to her impossible to extract without causing more harm. Despite the cruel tabloids and the stares, Priscilla has displayed a backbone of steel, refusing to hide in the shadows just because her reflection changed. She didn't pull a Greta Garbo and vanish. She kept hitting red carpets and driving her philanthropic missions, sending a silent but powerful message that even legends can be victims and there is no shame in survival. A veteran entertainment reporter who sat down with her before and after the incident noted the stark contrast, a transition from timeless elegance to a swollen, patchy and clearly traumatised visage. However, the most striking takeaway isn't the physical change, but her absolute refusal to let a botched procedure dictate her existence or erase her from the public eye. It takes a serious amount of grit and dignity to stand in front of the flashing cameras and live your life out loud after enduring such a public and visible violation. While Priscilla's nightmare was a case of criminal negligence, our next story highlights a different kind of tragedy, how standard legal cosmetic work can strip away the very magic that made a star one of a kind. Let's turn the spotlight on Carol Baker, the woman who was once Hollywood's ultimate baby doll, only to become a cautionary tale of repackaging gone wrong. She absolutely shattered the status quo and burst onto the scene with her scandalous, heat-inducing performance in the 1956 classic Baby Doll. It was that intoxicating mix of raw sex appeal and wide-eyed innocence that instantly crowned her as Tinseltown's newest obsession and certified bombshell. Unlike the carbon copy blondes flooding the studios back then, she had a face you couldn't forget, specifically those pouty, pillow-soft lips and eyes that seemed to speak volumes without saying a word. Sadly, the very traits that put her on the map were destined to be tweaked, pulled and altered until they were virtually unidentifiable. As one historian of 1950s cinema astutely noted, she was the industry's forbidden fruit, irresistible and perfect right up until she decided to mess with the packaging. It is rare to see a celebrity actively dismantle the unique genetic lottery win that made them a star, but she managed to wipe the slate clean in the worst way possible. If you look at the footage from her heyday, her allure was raw and specific. Sure, she was gorgeous, but she wasn't just another factory-made blonde rolling off the studio assembly line. She had a certain quirkiness to her visage that carved out a lane entirely her own, separate from the bombshell dominance of icons like Marilyn Monroe or Jane Mansfield. It was the geometry of her face, the slightly wider set gaze and that naturally voluptuous mouth that burned her image into the audience's mind. When the offers in the States started drying up towards the end of the 1960s, she packed her bags for Europe, reinventing herself as a sultry icon of Italian cinema. By the time she made her Hollywood comeback in the late 70s and 80s for a few gigs, eagle-eyed fans began to notice that something about her looked just a little bit different. At first, it was just the usual maintenance, the kind of nip and tuck every aging starlet relies on to keep gravity at bay. However, as the calendar flipped to the 90s and the 2000s, those subtle tweaks snowballed into something far more drastic and undeniable. Gone were the unique quirks of her youth, replaced by a visage that one ruthless critic labelled as the quintessential generic plastic surgery mask. It's that eerie uniform look that happens when surgeons try to force a distinct face into a cookie-cutter mould of what they think beauty should be. According to film experts, the real heartbreak here isn't simply that she looks done or fake, it goes deeper than that. The tragedy is the total erasure of her identity, that luscious pout, once her signature was stretched thin and pulled into a permanent tight grin. Her soulful eyes were hoisted up until she looked perpetually startled, transforming her from the one and only Carol Baker into a stranger who could be anyone. The irony stings when you realise that the assets she had naturally, especially that incredible mouth, were exactly what people kill for. She was born with the kind of features that future generations of actresses would spend thousands of dollars and endure endless injections to replicate. She had the blueprint everyone wanted for free, yet she chose to pay a fortune to destroy it. A makeup artist who saw her in the 90s put it best: it felt like she was actively trying to escape her own face, running away from the very trademark that made her famous. It is the paradox of Hollywood studios burn millions trying to manufacture a unique look while the stars who are born with it spend their wealth scrubbing it away. Throughout it all, Carol has remained tight-lipped, mostly dodging any direct questions about the work she has had done. However, in a few candid moments, she has hinted at the crushing weight of the industry's demand for eternal youth and the toll it takes on women. Her silence speaks volumes, leaving her altered face as a living monument to the brutal shifting beauty standards and the impossible tightrope walk of ageing in the spotlight. The cruelest twist of fate is imagining how stunning and regal she would have looked as an elder stateswoman of cinema if she had just let nature take its course. That sentiment was echoed by a veteran casting director who watched her evolution over the decades, mourning the loss of the natural beauty that could have been. Instead, she sadly enlisted in that tragic army of faded stars women with identical, shiny, pulled-tight faces where every ounce of uniqueness has been surgically sliced away along with their natural lines. While Baker's extreme makeover managed to completely erase the distinctive features that made her famous. Our final example is perhaps the most heartbreaking case of a total disconnect between a fiery living persona and a set of features that have been frozen in time. We are talking about Anne Margaret, the ultimate firecracker trapped behind a frozen mask. There have been very few icons in history who embodied raw sexual energy and vitality quite like she did. From her explosive breakout role in Bye Bye Birdie back in 1963, all the way through legendary classics like Viva Las Vegas. Starring alongside Elvis Presley, her entire appeal was built on that electric energy, those expressive eyes, and a vibrant personality that practically burned a hole in the screen, which is exactly why her later transformation feels so jarring. The fire was still blazing inside, but the face had completely checked out, remarked one entertainment journalist who had the chance to interview Anne-Margaret multiple times over the decades. Watching her attempt to project that naturally bubbly, vivacious personality through features that barely budged created a truly bizarre and uncomfortable cognitive dissonance for the viewer. You have to remember, Anne-Margaret's natural beauty in the 1960s and early 70s was distinct, wild, and incredibly expressive. She had those feline cat-like eyes, killer cheekbones, and an extraordinarily mobile face that could flip from sultry vixen to goofy comedian in a split second. Her entire acting style relied on that elasticity, making her later surgical decisions not just a cosmetic change, but a move that actively sabotaged her greatest gifts. The changes to her appearance didn't happen all at once. They crept in gradually over the years. By the late 1980s and early 90s, you could spot the subtle tightening here and there, suggesting she was dabbling with conservative procedures. But as the 90s bled into the 2000s, the modifications ramped up and became increasingly dramatic and impossible to ignore. Her once expressive face began to take on that distinctively tight, smooth sheen that is the hallmark of too many trips to the surgeon. What made Anne-Margaret's situation stand out was the stark contrast between her physical energy and the total immobility of her face, explained a television director who worked with her during the 2000s. She still moved like a teenager with incredible vitality, dancing up a storm, gesturing wildly. Fully energetic from the neck down, but then you looked above the neck and everything had become strangely static, like a statue. This disconnect created a nightmare scenario for directors trying to film her in those later years. The dynamism and spark that defined her early career were still very much alive in her body and her voice, but her face had simply retired. It could no longer provide the expressive punctuation that was the core of her style. "We literally had to change our entire filming strategy with her," the director continued. "We went for more movement, more full-body shots, and significantly less reliance on those intimate close-ups that used to work so beautifully with her natural face, but now just highlighted how frozen her features were. The modifications were perhaps most tragic when she tried to smile, an expression that used to be wide, infectious, and expressive, but had become noticeably constrained and tight. The natural crinkle of her eyes and the movement of her cheeks during laughter, once the very essence of her charm, were replaced by a severely limited range of motion. Multiple facelifts and heavy Botox use made her nearly unrecognisable in her later television appearances, as noted by a longtime fan who meticulously archived her performances. Honestly, if you showed someone just her face from a 2010 interview, they probably wouldn't even be able to identify her as Anne-Margaret. But the second she moved or spoke, that undeniable spirit came rushing through, unmistakable as ever. What makes Anne-Margaret's transformation so particularly poignant is that, unlike some stars who vanished from the public eye, as they got older, she stayed in the spotlight, continuing to perform with incredible energy well into her 70s. This created a heartbreaking visual record of a vibrant performer fighting to express a full emotional range through a face that had increasingly limited mobility. There is something almost heroic about her refusal to let her light dim, reflected a choreographer who worked with her during this era. She still gets out there and performs with the energy and stamina of someone decades younger. It is just a tragedy that the very procedures meant to preserve her youthful glow ended up putting a cage around the very expressiveness that made her a legend.